Brussels has long billed it as an EU success story. So why did Poland just vote for a pro-Trump candidate? Karol Nawrocki narrowly elected president, in part thanks to a first-round surge by candidates further to his right. Why is a nation that's a net recipient of EU funding, one that shares a border with Belarus and the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad, turned its back on Brussels? We'll ask if time perhaps is soon up for the swing of 2 years ago in favor of the reformist coalition led by centre-right Prime Minister Donald Tusk, and draw conclusions from the defeat of Warsaw Mayor Rafał Trzaskowski. Could there even be a snap general election? What about that ongoing battle over the independence of the courts in Poland, culture war issues like abortion, and what attitude towards Ukraine and European defense? Historical rivalries with Kyiv were chalked up on the campaign trail, but historical rivalries are even greater with Moscow. Just as the likes of Germany and France scramble to level up on defense, Sunday's winner clearly believes that his backers in Washington will be maintaining the 10,000 U.S. troops stationed in Poland. A sure bet? Can Poland be both Atlantist and Euroskeptic? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at Poland's pro-Trump pivot. With us from Warsaw, France 24 correspondent Gulliver Cragg. Good evening, Gulliver. Zbigniew Peszybowski is International Development Director at the Ordo Juris think tank. Thank you for joining us from the Polish capital.
Thank you for having me. Good evening.
From Gdansk, Karolina Zbytniewska, editor-in-chief of the news site Euractiv. Good to see you.
Great to be here. Good evening.
And we welcome back France 24 alumna, Anna Kowalska, Paris correspondent for Polish public broadcaster TVP. Good to see you.
Great to be back. Thanks for having me.
You can always listen to the France 24 debate wherever podcasts are streamed. 50.9%, 370,000 votes, the difference. Narrow margin of victory for the candidate of the outgoing Law and Justice Party's Andrzej Duda. This after a roller coaster election night, as Elias Herbert explains.
Karol Nawrocki supporters were jubilant in the early hours of Monday morning. After a race that came down to the wire, the polls tipped in the national candidate's favour, putting him on track to win the presidential election.
We managed to unite the entire patriotic camp in Poland, the entire camp of people who want a normal Poland, want a Poland without illegal migrants, a safe Poland.
He beat Liberal candidate Rafał Trzaskowski by less than 2% of votes, a grim moment for the mayor of Warsaw, who had prematurely declared victory earlier in the evening.
Zwyciężyliśmy!
The results will also be a blow for Prime Minister Donald Tusk. While the presidential role is largely ceremonial, it does hold veto powers over bills introduced by the government. And Nawrocki has made clear he intends to use them.
We will not allow Donald Tusk to have a monopoly on power or a bad government that doesn't care about public finances and deprives us of our big dreams and aspirations.
Nawrocki is expected to further stymie Tusk's progressive agenda to reform abortion legislation, LGBTQ rights and climate policies. And his election also has broader implications for Europe. During Tusk's 2 years in office, he has sought to increase Warsaw's influence in the EU and has become a key leader alongside Paris and Berlin in the response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Nawrocki, however, campaigned under the slogan Poland first, Poles first. And while he says he will continue to support Kyiv, he is against it joining NATO. The 42-year-old is a former amateur boxer, an admirer of US President Donald Trump, and presents himself as a man of traditional Catholic values.
And Gulliver Cragg, we're expecting to hear from Poland's Prime Minister.
We haven't heard yet from Donald Tusk. He did
participate in the campaign, at one point saying he was extremely depressed and saddened when he heard about a scandal that one of several that erupted surrounding Karol Nawrocki, about how Karol Nawrocki had, by underhand means, basically got his hands on an apartment in Gdańsk for cheap, exploiting an elderly man. And the thing is, though, that a lot of people felt that they were voting against Donald Tusk by voting against Rafał Trzaskowski. That was part of the rhetoric of the Karol Nawrocki campaign, and they couldn't perhaps make up their mind whether or not Tusk could be an asset or a liability to the campaign to get Rafał Trzaskowski into office. It'll be interesting to hear what Donald Tusk has to say now, but I mean, clearly this is absolutely terrible news for him. There's just no denying it.
No denying it. Anna Kowalska, there's some even saying, because remember, his Civic Platform Party is in a coalition, that coalition could perhaps fall apart?
There's been a meeting today between leaders of the coalition and the chief of the parliament, who is one of them, said that the coalition is strong and they're now willing to move forward even faster to push the reforms, to prove to Poles that they can deliver. I guess one of the reasons why Rafał Trzaskowski lost and Karol Nawrocki won is this, that the government in the end didn't manage to deliver, according to at least right-wing electors. Donald Tusk is expected to speak today at 8 p.m. We don't know what he's going to announce, but before the second round, it was clear for him that there won't be snap elections, no matter what the elections results will be. So according to him, according to the members of the coalition, he wants to take this battle till the end so that the next elections will go according to the plan in 2.5 years.
Zbigniew Pszybiowski, how do you interpret this result?
Well, I think that we need to start with correcting the incorrect framing of this election. I don't think that Karol Nawrocki is a pro-Trump candidate. And the election in Poland was not about Mr. Trump. I think the division is between pro-European Union as a centralist state and pro-independent sovereignist nations. And I think that would be the correct framing. And I think the opposition of Karol Nawrocki overplayed their hand. They were moving too quickly with the introduction of the changes that were negotiated in regards of the changes of the EU treaty, and the Poles are just alarmed. So, you know, having lost our country and our independence for 124 years and being second grade, second quality citizens in a number of countries, we value our country very much. And Poles were alarmed by the changes that were being introduced. So that's one thing. And the other thing is, I think it was also a question of credibility and of authenticity. And I think a lot of people understood that Mr. Nawrocki is one of them, and Mr. Trzaskowski is playing one of them and is not playing that one of them well. So I think that there were the two main issues.
One of them, there were chants of Trump at his campaign headquarters on the night. So are you sure this isn't, I mean, and he goes all the way to Washington for that photo op in the Oval Office?
Yes. Yes. So when they're chanting Trump, they're chanting for a politician who is putting his country first. And they want Polish politicians to put Poland first. And in Europe, there isn't a second, well, maybe Mr. Orban, arguably, is a person who is putting Hungary first ahead of the European Union. And the Poles want Poland to be put first before the European Union. Our constitution first before the EU treaties. And I think this is why they're chanting Trump, because otherwise, what would they be chanting? Weber, or Macron?
Karolina Zbigniewska, how do you interpret the result?
Thank you. So first, I think that it's more about Rafał Trzaskowski and Civic Platform losing than about Karol Nawrocki winning. So first, Trzaskowski lost because of Tusk's government. He carried the political cost of 1.5 years of squandering of the public trust with I must say, sorry for that, for the hubris of the government, of the current government. So the government's dismissive and arrogant treatment of its own social base. Infamously, Donald Tusk even didn't hire a spokesperson for himself nor for the government, staying one himself. So Nawrocki and his spin doctors skillfully managed to fuse Trzaskowski with Tusk, making them seem one, presenting Trzaskowski as a kind of an irrelevant Tusk's assistant. This framing played a huge role in the public imagination, turning the election into a kind of a referendum about Tusk's government. And importantly, at the moment, Donald Tusk is being 50% of Poles are dissatisfied with Donald Tusk. So this fusion that I mentioned is very, very harmful to Trzaskowski. But also on the second side, why did Nawrocki actually win? So what we have seen is predominantly a partisan heuristic in action. So most voters use this cognitive shortcut that Nawrocki equals peace, law and justice. So focusing on Nawrocki, basically whomever a peace candidate would be, this person would have a strong chance of gaining the votes of peace electorate. And he also symbolized an uncompromising sovereignty, the one that my predecessor here commented. I totally agree. So he symbolized an uncompromising sovereignty preached by peace, Poland that rises up from its knees. Nawrocki was identified with this vision of strong, sovereign, nativistic Poland, and ultra-conservative one and proud, against the European Union, against Germans, against Macron mentioned before, against Ukraine and Ukrainians, but also against the perceived weaknesses. So this masculinist vibe was very strong within Nawrocki's campaign, masculinist vibe of a strongman of Nawrocki, and one that it would be associated with the new now really sovereign Poland. So I have a lot of points more, but I think that I will stop here
we'll get back to that point about a masculinist image. Nawrocki, a 42-year-old historian, controversial past, as Gulliver Cragg was telling us earlier, overcoming a string of revelations on the campaign trail. Kemi Knight has more on the president-elect of Poland.
Karol Nawrocki had no political experience before the campaign that led to his presidency. The 42-year-old historian and former boxer wasn't even a party member until he was backed by the Conservative Law and Justice Party that previously governed Poland. He was at the head of the Institute of National Remembrance, known for embracing nationalist historical narratives.
We must do everything we can to ensure that Poland remains Poland, rich in its cultural heritage, in its attachment to what is enshrined in our national community, to the symbol of the cross and to Christian values.
The skeletons that tumbled out of Nawrocki's closet during the presidential election campaign did little to deter his electorate. In March, it emerged that he had appeared on a TV show in disguise, blurred out and using a pseudonym to promote a book he had written about the life of a gangster. Then, last month, it was revealed he lied about acquiring a second apartment, the circumstances of which involved taking advantage of an elderly pensioner. Polish media have also reported on his connections to the underworld, something he denies. But when it recently came out that he took part in a brawl in Gdansk involving 140 rival football hooligans, Nawrocki described the fight as a form of noble combat.
At the end of the day, I think he is even more radical or more conservative than Andrzej Duda was. If we would like to compare the representative of Law and Justice, Karol Nawrocki is definitely more into the MAGA direction.
Nawrocki is a champion of US President Donald Trump, who he met at the White House weeks before the election. And just like Trump, Nawrocki appears to have a base that's immune to the noise about his past.
So, Anna Kowalska, this you heard earlier Karolina talk about this masculinist image we saw in that report, the boxer, the guy who mixes it up with football hooligans, and it works with how much of the demographic?
It works with a lot of youth, men especially, the youth, and that's kind of the biggest surprise of this election. I have the numbers here. 53% of youth, so below 29 years old, voted for Karol Nawrocki, which is unusual. Usually they vote more on the left, but in this case, in the first round of the election, especially young men, voted for the extreme far right, which is Konfederacja, which came up third, and then Grzegorz Braun, which came up fourth. They ideologically are much closer to Karol Nawrocki than to Rafał Trzaskowski. That's why they also voted in favor of him in the second round. And sociologues, politologues try to explain why. One of the reasons is effectively this masculinity crisis of masculinity movement. Karol Nawrocki presents himself as a strong candidate physically, so this might have worked, but it's not possibly the only reason.
But so same as kind of war of the sexes, if you will, with the under 30 crowd that you saw in Germany in February in their general election, with the women voting for Die Linke and the men voting for the AfD.
And in America, and it proves the point, in Poland, especially young women are much more likely to vote extreme left because they care about their rights to abortion, about their space in the job market. That's not the case for men.
All right, this gender gap, we talked about it on the show last Thursday. After the first round, a surprising number, as Anna was saying, of under 30s men who voted for the far-right candidates. Far-right candidates to the right of Karol Nawrocki, a point picked up on the day after the runoff in the streets of Warsaw.
I think that the right wing in general, both in the West and in the East, is becoming more and more slick, is building itself up, is becoming more and more popular, especially among young people. I think that this is due to the radicalism of some leftist circles, and because of this, the radical left is becoming off-putting to those on the outside.
Gulliver Craig, this talk about radical leftism, what do you make of that?
Well, I think the radical left, despite what that guy was just saying, I think that the radicalism of the left is also attracting some people who were supporters of Sławomir Mencen or other candidates from the far right. We saw a very small, modest surge by Adrian Zandberg, the candidate of the most radical left-wing candidate in the first round. I mean, he only got about 5%, but he was predicted to get much less than that. And I think it's when people saw him on TV during the debates, he hadn't had an expensive campaign with lots of posters as Sławomir Mencen had, that he attracted some of the voters from the far right precisely because of his radicalism, because people just want something different, because they don't trust the political class. They see somebody who's radical somehow as being honest. And when you talk to young people, I was making a report about how young people voted largely for either the far right or the radical left. And you meet groups of people in which, quite happily hanging out with each other, there would be some who opted for the far left and some who opted for the far right. That's not something that you'd find in France at all.
So are you saying that Poland is not as polarized as it once was, that instead it's just the big parties that are kind of crumbling?
Well, we're talking about the youth in particular here. This polarization is still extremely strong, but I think it's stronger in older generations. Certainly there's a feeling of very tribal belonging to one or the other camp. And there's also a division. It's not just this sort of tribal division. There's also a class division, right? Mostly more educated people tend to favor the liberals, the pro-European vector, and in smaller towns, villages, and less educated people, poorer people, they tend to favor the Law and Justice Party, which of course is still remembered for its generous social programs, what was 500 plus, it's now 800 plus the amount of zlotys given to families per children per month. And I think that the Civic Platform Party of Donald Tusk suffered for having said that this would bring economic catastrophe on Poland, spending that much money, these handouts, that it would be an economic disaster. And it wasn't. Even during the years of Law and Justice, despite all the problems with the European Union and so on, Poland mostly maintained pretty steady, good economic growth. And that dented the credibility of the Liberals, who would say, you know, we can't afford to spend any more on social programs. Of course, they would argue that it's much better to spend it more intelligently, but that's a more complicated topic for discussion, which doesn't suit election sloganeering.
Zbigniew Peszebowski, let me ask you, because again, the rest of the European Union looks at Poland and sees how standard of livings have soared in the 2 decades since Warsaw joined the European Union. They don't understand this division.
Yes. However, this is anecdotal information, but I've spoken with many young people, and young men see that with the developments, economic developments in Europe right now, and in Poland as well, they don't see much future for them. They don't see a possibility to buy and own a home. They don't see a possibility to buy and own a car. And people like Adrian Zandberg were drawing their attention to this. And I think this is a reason why a lot of young people voted for Karol Nawrocki in the second round, because they were just opposing Rafał Trzaskowski. So we are on a sort of upward trajectory in terms of our wealth, but we are already feeling the bite of Green New Deal, of the limitations on the emissions of CO2, and we already feel that this trajectory is about to end, and people are aware of that. If I may just add one thing about the masculinity. I don't think it has anything to do with the war of sexes that you have mentioned. I think that the Poles, a lot of them remember, and some have heard from their parents what war is about. And they know that in wartime, you need to have strong leaders and you need to have courageous leaders. And that's why the stories about boxing and about whatever brawls he participated in did not discourage people. On the contrary, they showed that this is a man who is not afraid. And, he's a masculine person as opposed to Mr. Trzaskowski. And that's why I think that was already.
What do you mean by that, as opposed to Mr. Trzaskowski?
Trzaskowski, he does not project that strength of personality. He does not project the courage. And one of the things, if I may, one of the things that is also working against Mr. Trzaskowski is his words during the electoral campaign were contradicting his actions as a president of Warsaw, and a lot of people know that.
Karolina Zbigniewska, you opened this Pandora's box talking about the masculinist electorate. Is this what you meant? This is the issue that a lot of men in Poland want a strong guy.
When we look at the polls, at the exit polls, and at the who was voting for which candidate, we see that even if there were more women voting for Trzaskowski and more men voting for Nawrocki, it was all the time something around 50. So he didn't manage to persuade all men. So Nawrocki offered, as I mentioned, turbo masculinity, and also a kind of masculine turbo patriotism. It was what my predecessor said, an argument, a serious argument for his core electorate, so for core peace voters. However, a part of the voters who chose him in the second round was this electorate of radical candidates from the first round. So especially their major vibe was this anti-establishment characteristic. So here it was less about this sovereignist part of masculinity understanding, and more a kind of an anti-establishment figure to follow, masculine leader. So this turbo masculinity has been, as I mentioned already, transcended into the vision of Poland that he was talking about, while Trzaskowski at the same time offered a kind of sometimes nauseous post-political ideals of smiling, united Poland. And instead of choosing, like Nawrocki, a very strict and evident agenda, he rather withdraw not to offend anyone, to please everyone, which is, as we know, impossible to do. For me, what was evident in shaping Nawrocki's political brand, because we are talking about a brand here, was this clear masculinist brand that was chosen by his spin doctors. So it was indeed especially important for male voters, but not only. He, as we saw in the material before, was an avid boxer, former hooligan, but also a former doorman. He was introduced to the Polish community, Polish nation in last November, with a focus on his underdog manly rise. He entered, actually, I don't know if you know, that he entered the stage for the first time, surrounded by the song from the Rocky movie. And his lifetime shows a rise from a modest social background to the doctorate in history and to the heading of an important institute of national memory. So he was created to become and be shown as this everyman, as a guy next door, so that he shows that everyone can make this trajectory in his life.
It's interesting because we're poring over the election returns and the post-exit polling on the day after the vote. Here's a statistic for you. New figures show a new low for Poland's birth rate. The Notes from Poland website reporting on how the National Statistics Agency finds that it's 1.0 child per woman. Which is a low in Europe, one of the lowest in the world. In fact, it's interesting because Anna Kowalska, you heard Zbigniew talk about this sense that perhaps it's the end of the pro-EU rise that we're witnessing. This decline with the lowering birth rate, is that something that's perhaps not spoken but felt?
Well, we're speaking about this in Poland, and majority of women, obviously, there's many reasons why women in Poland don't want to have kids. One of them is economic insecurity, but also many of them quote abortion rights that have been massively restricted by Law and Justice Party. But I just wanted to come back to say one thing. I don't think this election result isn't such a big surprise as we all think. Poland has been divided for 10 or 15 years. In 2023, the liberal parties managed to really motivate the electorate so that the turnout was very, very high, 74 if I remember right, percent. And that's the only reason why they won elections. They didn't manage to motivate the same electorate this time. That's why Karol Nawrocki won. So this division, and it was
a high turnout, by the way, 71%.
But not enough, according to the numbers from the past elections.
It's just 2 points short of the general election 2 years ago.
According to the numbers, Rafał Trzaskowski, someone counted, needed about 74% turnout in order to win these elections. He didn't, because some of the voters from 2023 were, for instance, disappointed with how the government is ruling the country. But this division in Poland has been clear. Right and liberals for the past 15 years, and we are talking about division, as Gulliver perfectly explained, higher, lower education, cities, villages. In cities over 500,000 inhabitants, Rafał Trzaskowski got 67% of the votes, and it's an extreme other right in the villages. So this division has been going on forever. On top of it, you have the right turn pretty much all over the world, and that's enough for peace to go back to power.
So, Gulliver, let me ask you, because out on the campaign trail, how Eurosceptic did you find crowds? What did people see as how much Poland differentiates itself from the rest of Europe?
There's certainly a groundswell of Euroscepticism. I spoke to some people who absolutely straight out said they wanted to leave the European Union, and they thought more and more Poles would want to leave. That's a minority view at the moment. Most Poles are still pretty Europhile. The country, of course, has benefited financially massively from its membership of the European Union. But some analysts think that that's the direction of travel, and that when Poland, as its economic growth buoys it further and further up, ceases to be a net recipient of EU funds and becomes a net contributor, things could look very different indeed. I actually wanted to come back on what Zbigniew Przybylowski was saying about how people voted for Karol Nawrocki because they don't like the EU as a super state. They want it as a community of nations. That is the right-wing nationalist narrative in Poland. And I heard people saying that they were afraid of federalization of Europe, and that's why they were voting for Karol Nawrocki. And that narrative is, in a way, somewhat deceptive. The European Union is not talking about federalization or about becoming a super state. It isn't really moving towards much deeper integration. Arguably, some issues such as the green policies are a little bit, impinging a little bit more. But generally, that's not the direction of travel of the European Union. And the problem that the Law and Justice Party has with the European Union is that the European Union called it out for being in violation of the rules that Poland signed up to when it joined the European Union in 2004, in terms of respecting the separation of powers, the rule of law, and the independence of the media. And that's why they've built up this narrative about a super state. And I think that quite a lot of Poles have been in some way deceived by that and become more fearful of the European Union than they need to be.
And when it comes to the Tusk coalition's plans to undo the judicial reforms under the Law and Justice Party, how does that stand now that Poland's re-elected a peace president?
Well, I think they won't be able to do it by legislating. They could only possibly do it by means that would immediately expose them to criticism for violating democratic procedures, which they might argue that the Law and Justice Party violated those procedures in order to achieve what they achieved, and that therefore they have to be violated again in order to undo it. Some people are arguing for that, but I frankly don't think it's likely that they'll go down that route, given the fragility and the unpopularity of this government. They used the fact that Andrzej Duda would veto legislation that they tried to pass to undo the judicial reforms as an excuse for not doing it. But they didn't actually put it to the test. He only vetoed 12 pieces of legislation, Andrzej Duda. Not that many were put before him, and that's actually probably because the coalition itself finds it quite hard to get anything passed because there are so many differences of opinion within that governing coalition.
All right, among the reactions, well, we saw some polite congratulations on the social medium formerly known as Twitter, X, from the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, who's confident that the EU will continue its very good cooperation with Poland. We are all stronger together in our community of peace, democracy, and values. Contrast that, if you will, with the enthusiasm out of Budapest.
First of all, there was a great patriotic victory in the presidential election in Poland. This victory provides a new opportunity to return the Hungarian-Polish interstate relations, which were deliberately destroyed by the Polish government, to their old course.
Karolina Zbigniewska, your reaction?
You mean my reaction to the
to the joy in Hungary today?
Speech?
Yeah.
Well, I'm sure what is being enjoyed in Hungary will become important in 1 or 1.5 years' time, when there will be the advanced negotiations over the European Union next budget. So I'm sure that such formats, like, for example, Visegrad 4, will come together again.
Yeah, that club of nations that brings together, that also brings together the Czech Republic and Slovakia.
Exactly. And, at the same time, Viktor Orban's role is at the moment under threat because of the opposition party Tisza, that is actually polling higher than Fidesz, and it's unprecedented situation within the last 15 years that actually Orban has been in power. So they for sure enjoy any signs of how to break the chances of pro-liberal forces being successful. That's why this much of an enjoyment. But whoever would mean, I'm sure that a kind of cooperation between Poland and Hungary, and as I said, the whole Visegrad Four would be back in town in 1 year because of the pragmatic goals that Poland and the region has in negotiations of the next European Union multi-annual budget.
Zbigniew Peszybowski, they've just released a healthy chunk of change in Brussels. What is it? Something like 9.4 billion euros for Poland that had been held up. What's the view towards that negotiation that's ahead for the next budget?
Yeah, the change was held up for no reason, and it was released right before election. And that is not a coincidence. Let me just address something very quickly, something that Gulliver said, that Poland signed up to something 21 years ago. That's true. I remember these elections. Poland signed up to something, but that something has completely changed. Something has changed in the way that courts operate, in the way that the European Council operates, and in the way that the European Commission operates. And right now, we are in the process of pushing through 267 amendments to the treaties. And, these amendments were negotiated and approved by the former coalition. So that's why a lot of the mainstream parties are losing support from the polls, because we signed up to something, and that something is being changed in front of our eyes without
asking us. But didn't that something include an independent judiciary?
Yes, absolutely. Independent judiciary. If you apply the same criteria to German judiciary and Spanish judiciary and French judiciary and Polish, we'll be completely fine with that. But if you have two sets of standards, well, then we have a problem with that.
Let me ask you, Karolina Zbigniewska, are there two sets of standards when it comes to the judiciary?
What I wanted to mention in terms of judiciary and the rule of law, I would say that it's a major difference between a so-called pro-European camp in Poland and peace camp, in a way. So the one that made Nawrocki president now. So because other stances of Poland towards the European Union, major legislation like the pro-transformation in energy legislation, like Migration Pact and others, most of them are actually similar in terms of our party's approaches. What's different? It's rhetoric. So the stances are the same. So I would say maybe I can turn now into how the European Union policy of Poland will change now after Nawrocki. Because I think it's very important in the context of our discussion. So Nawrocki's election may harden internal political divisions in Poland, impair the decision-making, also in terms of our European Union legislation power, and generally impair Poland's agency and credibility in Brussels. Certainly, an internal civil war will harm Poland, but also the EU and our international standing, but will not destroy it, as we'll see, for example, in France with Macron. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was going to put it to Anna Kowalska because the news cycles change so fast. Donald Tusk, former president of the European Council, so everybody knows him in Brussels. At the beginning of the year, Macron seemed weakened after his dissolution of parliament. There was no government yet in Germany. Tusk was in a way seen as the point man of Europe.
But I don't think, on the contrary to we've been hearing, that this presidential election has been a referendum on the European Union in Poland. I think it was more of a referendum in between what's happening in between the populists and the elites. European Union, and I've been following the campaign closely, there's been some of it, but talking about treaties or ratifying certain new laws, not that much of that, really. People globally benefit in Poland from the European Union, and let's not forget that 137 billion in total of EU funds and cohesion funds have been defrozen since Donald Tusk is back in power. So I think that remains an important point. So not really a referendum on the European Union, more of a referendum but it's important also to remind our viewers that it's not the president but the Prime Minister, Donald Tusk, who is going to the European summits in Brussels, and he represents Poland on this level. I agree, however, that it may be much harder to ratify certain agreements with the European Union if Karol Nawrocki is in the presidential
Okay,
race.
but we've had, and you were witness to this firsthand. You had earlier this month in the eastern French city of Nancy,
yes,
this defense pact that was signed between the Polish leader and his French counterpart Emmanuel Macron. And that, I know it's a bilateral treaty, same as when there's a meeting of the so-called Weimar Triangle that brings in Poland, France, and Germany. It's not all of the EU. But for those who are pro-EU, they see this as a sign of further European integration on defense. Certainly.
And that's absolutely the direction France wants to go. Today, Emmanuel Macron, while congratulating Karol Nawrocki, said that he's hoping to maintain this level of involvement as in the Nancy Treaty. I don't think Karol Nawrocki will be willing to go in this direction because he's been criticizing not only this treaty, but this European sovereignty before. He's much more likely to go and look for aid with you know where, in Washington with Donald Trump. So it will be very interesting. This old European core still looking for European sovereignty, for instance, in terms of military spendings, military investment as well. And Emmanuel Macron is the one pushing for it very hard. I don't know if he will have such a big ally in Poland as it used to be for the past 2 years.
All right. The U.S., by the way, with some 10,000 troops that rotate at any time in and out of Poland. A strong presence. Zbigniew Peszybewski, we saw during Trump's first presidency how he increased the number of U.S. forces present in Poland. Under Trump, too, is that a safe bet, betting that the United States will be there to ensure Poland is safe militarily?
It's not a safe bet, and it's not a safe bet to bet on the assistance of France. We have poor experience with that. I think the only safe bet is to spend money on arms and preparation ourselves. Let me just point one thing. When we are talking about Euroscepticism, this is not about Europe. This is about the inefficiency and the failures of the European Union as it works right now. And, you know, remember 20 years ago, the European economy was similar to that of the United States. Right now, it's only 66% of that of the United States, and we are going down compared to the United States. So I think what we want to see is a change in how European Union operates so that all of our countries become rich again, become powerful again, including militarily, okay? And I think that the best defender of the eastern flank would be those who are endangered, you know? And if there is a war between the European Union and, God forbid, and Russia, this war is not going to be fought in France. It's going to be fought in Poland. So I think we need to be prepared ourselves. We need to rely upon ourselves because it's very easy to sacrifice faraway countries.
Gulliver Cragg, your other day job is covering that war in Ukraine. Does this election have an impact?
I think it does, and I'm not sure that people in Ukraine quite realize the potential impact that it could have, because Karol Nawrocki's election campaign took PiS, the Law and Justice Party, in something of a different direction, away from its traditionally pro-Ukrainian stance. He was more talking about Ukrainian immigrants in Poland. There's friction, of course, 3.4 million of them. It's a huge influx, and so it's something quite easy for politicians to play on. And talking about cutting their benefits, talking about not letting them be first in the queue for doctors, putting them to the back of the queue, things like that. That doesn't necessarily affect Ukraine's war effort, but it certainly sets the tone. Also, the farmers who blockaded the border with Ukraine, complaining about Ukrainian imports undercutting their prices, they're more in favour of the right-wing nationalist parties, and Karol Nawrocki, I think, will be thinking about defending their interests, and is signing up absolutely to the far-right Sławomir Menczen's demand that he commit to not allowing Ukraine to join NATO. I mean, nobody's saying that Ukraine is going to join NATO soon or in a situation where it's at war and Article 5 would be triggered immediately, but taking it off the table completely is generally considered to be something that is bad for Ukraine's security. And also just anything that weakens the European Union, I think, has to be seen as something that is desirable for Vladimir Putin. He's trying to put wedges in everywhere in Europe in order to weaken the united European stance, and that's something I think Ukrainians would have good reason to be worried about.
We'll have to leave it there, unfortunately. So much more to talk about. Gulliver Cragg, I want to thank you for being with us from Warsaw. Same with Zbigniew Peszebejowski. I want to thank as well Karolina Zbytniewska in Gdansk, and as well Anna Kowalska. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.